Okay, we're good. It's working. You never know. All right. Hello,
Um,
everybody. Gene, you want to kick us off?
yeah, sure. So welcome to the first session of MicroCamp 2024. And as is our new tradition, new as of last year, we're starting off with a conversation with someone who is not part of the micro.blog community, but somebody who is certainly active in what most of us are really interested in, blogging, social media, online community, and somebody who can help give us a new perspective of how we got to where we are, where we are going in this space. And that person this year is Christina Warren. Welcome, Christina.
Hey, thank you so much.
I'm
And
so
it's true.
glad.
It
Yeah.
is true. I'm not part of the community per se, but I did back the Kickstarter campaign
Oh, yes.
way
Oh,
back in the day. So
Thank you.
I'm not like a current member, although I definitely have like aspirations to be. We've talked about that, but I am an early admirer. Sorry, didn't
Awesome.
mean to.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
I,
I'm still working on finishing everything I promised, but in the Kickstarter, we'll save that for
let's
that another topic,
let's
another
put that
time.
aside. That's a
Yeah.
different podcast altogether. Um, Yeah, I could have looked that up actually. Now that you said it, I was like, it was. I still have that list of Kickstarter backers, and it's pretty exciting because a lot of people were very excited, myself included, when the was launched and Manton made a stretch goal to hire a community manager. That made me think like that could be really cool, and it is. And just to let folks know a little bit more about you. Christina is a software developer, journalist, and podcaster who frequently opines about the intersection of between technology and culture. That's the sort of high level of Christina, but on the human level, Christina is just a really awesome person. I met you. I don't know if you remember this. I met you in person, um, and I remember it because with Twitter, it kind of felt like you knew people that you still hadn't actually met. So I felt like I knew you. So I don't, but we actually were at a WWDC event for scholarship attendees. This is
Yeah.
like 10 years ago. And you were interviewing Tim Cook, I remember.
Yeah.
And then you and I chatted and about App Camp for Girls at the time. So, gosh, that was a while ago.
It was. No, I remember that very, very well because that was definitely when I was a journalist, interviewing Tim Cook was the pinnacle, I would say like you kind of don't get bigger than that. And that interview, how that came about was funny and was unexpected. But what was even better about that was being able to meet people like you who were there and the other scholarship attendees, which was a really great thing that Apple had started doing and I think continues to do, offering those scholarships and yeah, it was great. Like you said, we'd known each other from the internet, but finally meeting in person. And then we did some stuff with did a couple things with App Camp for Girls for a couple of years too. So
Yeah,
great.
that's
Yeah.
right. And of course, it's just I've been following your career since then, and you've done a lot of cool things. And um, I just remembered as we're talking, we Micro.blog was a sponsor of Rocket at one point, which
Oh,
was
yeah.
your
Yes.
long-running podcast on Relay FM. I I don't know why that slipped my mind too, but yeah. So what whatever. This is micro camp. We're calling it the most micro camp because of everything. It's been like a little bit just in time production this year. But let's go to our topic and which you know what? I used to do a podcast called Micro Monday where I would interview people on micro.blog. And one of the first questions I would ask them is like, how did you get started blogging? And in your case, like, where did it end up? If somebody says, what's the blogging life of Christina Warren
Gosh, it's a
timeline?
great question. It's a great question. So I guess it depends on how we're defining blog because the first time I ever wrote things on the internet was probably when I was I guess 12, and I had my first GeoCities website because I'm old, even though I like to pretend that I'm not. And then I got a LiveJournal account when I was in high school, and I think that was like my first real blog. And I loved LiveJournal, which for people who aren't familiar with it, it was Tumblr before Tumblr. And but it also had some aspects that the Facebook later, was inspired by and other things. And Brad Fitzpatrick, who created the service as a college student, really did some innovative things that I still don't think other types of kind of social networks have replicated in quite the same way. And that was kind of my start of that sort of world. And then that led to me, I probably had blogs on every hosted blogging platform that there was around. And then when I was in college, I was a frequent commenter on a couple of um, a number of different blogs all over the net, because this is like the mid 2000s, and so things were much smaller then. And so USA Today had like a music blog, and then their music editor at the time like ran a blog dedicated solely to American Idol, because it was 2007, and that was like the #1 TV show in America, and that was kind of like my secret like shame slash like guilty pleasure. And I was a frequent commenter on his blog, on both of the main music blog and the like more like music criticism and the American Idol blog. And I this is again 2007, like asked me, hey, we're looking for some contributors for online and print about American Idol. Do you want to be a contributor? So it was like me and like three people who knew what they were talking about, giving our analyses to the contestants each week. Which I when I look back on that, still I'm like I was in college. I did not have any business, opining in that space about that stuff. Um, and then that led me into doing more blogging for different blog networks, which was a thing back at the time, because that was all the rage. And so I wrote for a website called the Unofficial Apple Weblog, which no longer exists, and Download Squad, which no longer exists, and Stylist, which no longer exists, and some other things that no longer exist. And then that led me to working for a website called Mashable, which does still exist, but not in the way that it was when it was like actually good. And then that led me to working for a website called Gizmodo, which also still exists, but also in a much lesser form, because it's private equity. And then I transitioned out of the kind of day-to-day blogging grind into software development, and now I work at GitHub as a developer advocate. And I do still do some blogging stuff or newsletter writing. I guess it's actually more what it is now, which we might want to talk about that. There's been this interesting evolution over the last, decade, but I'd really say like the last like 5 to 8 years of, blogging as we kind of knew it in like the early mid aughts being reborn as newslettering. And, um, but primarily the stuff I do now is a little bit different, but yeah, that's kind of my origin story. Is honestly, it goes back to like being a high school student and sharing too much about my teenage angst and the music I was listening to on LiveJournal. That's where it goes.
Wow, that is great. That is like that was like those quick montages in sci-fi films where history passes before your eyes, like the time machine or something. I was like, wow, I'm just watching the time machine of online interaction go whizzing by, and here we are today. But I'll turn it over to Manton because I know he has some questions too.
Well, yeah, and even before that, it's interesting you brought up newsletters. I hadn't, like that. It feels like the way you framed it as like newslettering, as like this thing people do. It's fascinating to me because a lot of times I'll see, yeah, like the latest newsletter comes out and like it really is a blog, but like the blog parts are sort of hidden. In some cases, they're just not as like in your face or in reader's face as much. And it's like, yeah, it's just kind of like a new delivery mechanism. And I'm very curious if that's gonna, I don't know if that's really gonna stick with us or if that's gonna be more like a fad that maybe 5 years from now newsletters won't be quite as popular as, because not every, I mean, the dream of like having a newsletter and having paid subscribers, just like that's difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm very curious to see how that shakes out. But hopefully there'll be some blogging aspects that, will live on.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, and this is actually one of the things that's kept me from starting a newsletter because everybody's like, "We really want a newsletter from you," and I'm like, "I want to do one." And I have to be honest, like the biggest thing that's kind of prevented me from doing it is a little bit logistical because there's a part of me that's like, okay, yeah, I just use Substack or Ghost or Beehive or whatever and send those things out. But I want to have a written record, like I want a URL that people can go to as well
Yeah.
because that's always frustrating to me when I can't find an archive for someone's newsletter and when I can't find some place for people to go directly, right? Like I understand people like the email delivery mechanism and advertisers potentially like that too, and because you can track things like open rate and clicks and whatnot, as if you can't track those things on the web. Of course you can, but but people like those types of things, and I think there's at least in the beginning there was this kind of idea that it was like, oh well, you can be more selective about what you get from your newsletter. Um, of course, until everybody started having a newsletter and having 18,000 newsletters, and you subscribe to Bloomberg or the information or some of those like trade or Financial Times or any of the news publications, and then all of a sudden like you're getting like 30 newsletters a day, and you're like, okay, I didn't actually need this for every single story.
Yeah.
Like this is not what I wanted. This is making things worse. But no, but that's one of the things that has kind of prevented me from it. I'm like, okay, well, how can I do this in a way that people can get maybe either a digest or a certain selective updates, but I still want there to be an actual URL, that in an archive that exists too. Cause I don't know. I think that's important because I have the same
Yeah.
questions you do. Like, I don't know how sustainable it is. I mean, I think it's great when people are able to build a big enough following and have enough commitment to create content that people will pay for and build an audience that way. And that's tremendous. We saw this with blogging though too, like the number of people who can make their living off of their blog is very small versus the number of people who are interested in doing it. And that's okay, right? Like those things, those dynamics, don't have to exist where, everybody can do it. But as our attention, is more selective, it's kind of like how everybody wanted their own streaming service, and now we're back into like a rebundling era,
Yeah.
because it's just too much, right? Like the fallacy of choice is a real thing. It's like it's great to be able to have like an individual thing for everything, but at the same time there is something to be said like about like blogging networks go back to kind of my roots or web rings or whatever the case may be, where there is something to be said about having just a central place where you can get a lot of different things. Like that was what was great about LiveJournal back in the day, and that Tumblr still has, and that microblog actually as a community has, where you can have kind of a feed of different of people that you follow for different reasons and see that without having to make the distinctive choice. Okay, I want to get these specific things in my inbox or whatever mechanism I'm getting them from, because I think that it's not everybody's able to pay for as many newsletters as you might want to pay for, and B, it's a lot, right? Like it's
Yeah.
like I don't have enough time to read all of this,
Hmm.
or to go through these things. Like just can I just have a digest? Oh wait, we just invented the newspaper, right? Like
Yeah.
we just invented magazines again. you
Yeah.
know
I was thinking the same thing. It's like, ironically, the more successful newsletters are, the more you kind of want to go back to something like a feed reader where you can organize and
yes.
see your subscriptions, not junking up your email inbox. Yeah, but newsletters are great for like the couple thing, like that one person that you or a couple people that you want to hear from, um, all the time or whatever. But yeah, once it gets more than a few, personally, it gets overwhelming, and you just kind of want, man, maybe we should go back to RSS and
Yeah.
go back to the
Yes, please.
basics.
No,
Um,
honestly, I mean, I think yes, always to go back to RSS, right? I think that's one of the big, like the loss of Google Reader, I still think is one of the biggest losses we've had as an internet culture. And I wasn't even a super heavy Google Reader person. Like I used Fever actually, to well, and in that case, I think I probably was using maybe a Google Reader backend, but I was self-hosting myself. But just when Google Reader died, that kind of signaled to the world at large that RSS didn't matter anymore, and that you didn't have to have feeds, and that people didn't have to kind of invest in those kind of spaces, and you know uh, social networks had already been sort of limiting their feed compatibility even before that. But when I look back at like how the internet has changed over the last decade, I really do think sometimes like the loss of that as kind of an easy to use place for people to grab in a lot of information from a bunch of different sources is a tremendous loss that I don't think that we've, you know, like I think that that's like a when people are like, oh, how is the web worse than it was a decade ago? I was like, well, I guess now it's been more than a decade. It's been 11 years or something, but it's like, yeah, Google Reader doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean that was a huge moment, and I didn't really use Google Reader that much either, to be honest. But like I know everybody did, and everybody else in it, it just you could feel the change. And I feel like now we're going through a little bit of a disruption as well, as like Twitter is kind of imploding, is the way I usually say it, and then
Hmm.
Threads didn't exist a year ago, and here it is with 100, 150 million people or whatever using it. Blue Sky, Mastodon, like I just think it's a really exciting time, because we don't know exactly how things will play out, but there's this kind of like energy people have, like, you know, the web is back and there's like, and decentralization is back, even though we don't know how everything will actually play out. I don't know. What do you think of where we are and wherever we are here, mid 2024 on the web?
I I think it's exciting. I also feel a little bit lost, if I can be honest. And part of this might just be because I was on Twitter for a really long time. I'm still on Twitter. I'm
Hmm.
not, because of the work that I do, like it's not reasonable for me to be able to like completely get off of it. Although
Yeah.
my account was I was it was I wasn't well, I was restricted. I wasn't banned. I was restricted for something that I didn't do anything wrong. I accessed the network from a weird IP address. And I think that tripped something up in their systems. And needless to say, it was like 3 months before I was able to actually post on Twitter again. So
Mm.
between like November and February, like I couldn't post,
Yeah.
which was a good exercise for me, someone who's been, you know, addicted and has been posting, you know, dozens of times a day for, you know, 16 years, to have to reevaluate my entire relationship with social media, not just Twitter and not just, you know, things like, you know, Mastodon or Blue Sky and now Threads. Um, so part of it, I think, like how I look at these things is that I have to kind of maybe admit I feel a little bit lost because when Twitter imploded, you know, we had kind of one centralized place that even though it was not always or maybe even predominantly a great place, it was ours and you knew what to expect and everyone was there. And now you have all of these federated systems and alternative networks, and that's fantastic. But there is something to be said about, okay, like where's my audience for this? Where is my community for this? And if you're only interested in certain things and that's what you get out of the internet, then I think those spaces can work really, really well and you can find your community there. I think for some of us who have a lot of different interests in a lot of different areas, that makes it harder, right? Like
Hmm.
I can't talk about pop culture on Mastodon. I just can't.
Hmm.
No one cares about the Met Gala. No one cares about what's happening with Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck. No one cares about, you know, certain music drama. It just there might be a few select people there, but there's not like a wide, large community of people who are talking about it.
Hmm.
Um, Threads, you can a little bit, um, but Threads is going to show you stuff that happened 2 days ago, so you don't have that real time aspect, right?
Sure.
And then Threads also tends to how their algorithm works, like shows things to people who like don't know you, don't know any context about you, but yet you know you make an innocuous comment like I don't like mushrooms, and you have like 50 people in your replies yelling at you, how dare you, you're wrong. And I'm like, who are you, why are you here? Have you ever used the internet before? And do you understand the social norms of how networks work? And the answer is no, they don't. They've only used Facebook. So that's why they're there. And then Blue Sky is you know, you have a lot. I'm not as active on that anymore, but like that's a fun place, but it's smaller. But that's kind of like a lot of hyper online people, and again maybe more certain interests. Like I don't want to try to I'm not trying to generalize. But you have but I guess what I'm saying is like we used to have like one central kind of place, and now we have all these other splinter places. And there's great power in that. And I really like that. I think that's really exciting. And you can see the potential for new communities sprouting up. But at the same time, I think for some of us, there's also a loss because it means having to potentially use multiple services to get the same thing, or having to just kind of like restart. And that can be, I think the longer you've been online, restarting and refining your community, like it feels hard. It feels like work. You know, like when I started getting online and blogging and being on social networks, you know, it was new and exciting. And I think if you come to something that from that perspective, it probably still is. But if you've been at it for a long time, recreating those roots and refining those pockets, it gets harder each time you do it. And so I'm excited about the future, but I also do wonder. I mean, Jim Barksdale, who was um, I guess the first CEO of Netscape and a investor guy, big tech guy, he famously said like there are only two business models: bundling and unbundling. And I kind of feel like you can take that business part of it out of it and just be like, there are only two like internet models, like bundling and unbundling. And we're in kind of an unbundling phase, which is awesome. But I do kind of wonder, like, will we potentially be able to be, and this is where I think the potential of some of things like the Fediverse are, is that wouldn't it be cool if we could bundle things, but we could do it in a way that did give us more control, right? So you could have
Mhm.
a bundled experience that would bring all these different networks together and maybe in one interface, but go back to RSS again, but also let people have more control over what they do and don't want to see. I don't know.
Mhm.
That was a long
Yeah.
rambling answer.
No, no, yeah,
No,
no,
no.
it's a great point. And what's going to happen too. I mean, I've noticed the different kind of communities and sort of just the different feel of the different networks too. And as Threads experiments with kind of being on the Fediverse and allowing people to opt in so that, Mastodon folks can follow them, I'm very curious of what that's going to do to just like just different people that are attracted to different types of networks suddenly sort of the conversations being kind of like threaded together.
Yeah.
um yeah.
I, I mean,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that somehow on Twitter, we were able to have small communities on a big platform,
Hmm.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
like our, you know, developer tech, aficionado crowd, we could all find each other and hang out like it was the water cooler. We used to say that a lot. But it just got bigger and bigger, and then Twitter started to shift what they were after. Because I remember there used to be a website, and it was a joke. I mean, it was really just a URL that said like how to use Twitter for marketing and PR.com, and if you would go there, it would just say don't. That was a real website, so like that shows you where like back in it's almost Camelot of social media when we I mean, of course there were trolls, but there wasn't all quite the noise, and the political agenda type stuff wasn't quite as prominent. But my question is like, how do we, I mean, we were small but on a big community, and that way we could sort of branch out into other areas, but still you couldn't just post about anything and everything unless you were, I mean, some people like you, Christina, some people are following you because they care about everything that you say, but like me, I wouldn't post about like say like my interest in detective fiction, because I knew like I didn't really have that many detective fiction friends or whatever. Guinea pigs I would post, but of course everybody loves guinea pigs. That's not a problem. But I would definitely not post about certain subjects because I knew it would be crickets. Um, but this is just normal. This is like the human. We can't all go to a party, the same party, and talk to each other at the same time, and everybody be interested in what we're saying at the in
Totally.
each case. And what I'm seeing, and certainly in my own life, I have been sort of readjusting my attitude on social for the social media world, is that I can't follow everybody and I can't care about everything. So now I'm going to dial it back. I'm on Mastodon, but only really because those are my pals from Twitter. I sort of want to keep up with, but not. I don't want to. Micro.blog is a little different for me because, of course, being the community manager, I'm working when I'm on Micro.blog, but not for too long. Um, and now one of the things lately that I've gotten into is Substack, because there are, and it's for a couple of like communities that I'm involved with, writers, women writers, mostly women, and also people who are active in sobriety. communities. And these are people who do not want to be out there in the big marketplace of crap.
Yeah.
And I would just, like, that's one of the things I started to realize is that it worked out okay for me on Twitter, but it sure didn't work out okay for a lot of people who were, who were subject to harassment of it all sorts of time. But, women, because I can really only speak from that perspective, is that they would rather be on a cozy, closed platform with, maybe 1,000 subscribers, but maybe not even that many, and have little chats on Substack, which I've been doing, even though I hate it because it's so closed and locked and siloed. But I understand why that's where people feel safe having
Yeah.
having that kind of interaction. So anyway, I do think like, maybe is this emblematic of capitalism generally? There's a limit to
Yeah.
growth, and we were lucky to be there when it was still doable. But it's hard to do now. And so we're all finding our places, but it's frustrating because we used to be able to kind of find everybody in one place.
Yeah. But I think you bring up a good point too. Like, I do wonder, like, we spent about a decade and a half where kind of the default status of social media was whether and I mean that in a very broad sense, meaning blogs, meaning comments, meaning forums, meaning social networks, was to be open and was to be public. And then I think that to your point, maybe people saw the downsides of that, right? Like the very significant downsides. And I think around 2016, 2017, when political things changed, like that started to adjust things, and then it got even worse. And now I do wonder, like, you see like kind of the generations after us who have, come of age only when these things existed, have a different relationship to wanting to be public. But it's not just them, right? It's us too. It's like, okay, we were willing to accept that as the default when it existed, but when that default no longer exists as that place it is, I think you're right. It makes people want to maybe reevaluate, like, okay, I don't want to be in this open space where I can be harassed by anybody, or anyone can comment on something, or anyone can use what I've said against me. I want to be in these more closed spaces. And there's something completely understandable about that, even if maybe like ideologically, sometimes we're like, oh, but these things are hidden away, and this these communities aren't known. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay for us to be smaller. I think it's just an adjustment for at least for me, it's maybe had to rethink, like, okay, this was the default of how I was online for almost my entire life. And maybe, like, as a culture, we're having to reset that, and readjust.
Yeah, and I think it's related
Absolutely.
too to a little bit to where you're talking about with Twitter still being kind of the only place for sort of real-time news. And like I noticed Threads they've been very careful about, like, obviously they want to push the algorithm at you, but also like we're not going to bubble politics up into the feed. We're not going to nothing too controversial. Which I mean I totally get that, because we are similar on Microdot blog. Like, we're not interested in like making it just everything a debate, everything like everything is outrage. Um, but as Twitter, that like kind of real time feed, not real time, but like the where you can kind of see everything, you can search. There's hashtags that sort of started to break down. I feel like a little bit as Twitter got so big, and it was
Yeah.
so easy to jump into someone else's conversation and just be hateful and just harass people. And yeah, there has to be some kind of balance where people they can feel like their community is safe, but there's still some way where, yeah, I do want to see like people blogging about the Oscars, or writing about something that's live, something that's happening right now. And so you can feel like you're part of like that broader community too.
Yeah.
Well, um, the
These are
yeah,
the topics that just keep us going at micro.blog for sure.
yeah. One thing you mentioned when we were just getting started before we hit record, you were talking a little bit about kind of like the technical hurdles. And like we we on Micro.blog, we really try to have like all these APIs and open standards and embrace the indie web. At the same time, trying to make it easy because if it's more accessible, it's easier to post. People will blog, they'll have their own domain name, but it is hard. And I mean, even just things like getting a domain name is hard. And meanwhile, you have all these networks that we've been talking about that are in many ways, they're just so easy to get started. If you already have a Facebook account or Instagram account, you click and, you're
You're
posting
on
to
Threads.
Threads.
Yep.
So as someone, I guess, who you were so active in blogging and, like you mentioned, LiveJournal and other different blogging for other companies, and now seeing what things look like now for people starting a blog, like where do you think we are? And are we taking a step forward, back, somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think we've actually taken a step back, at least when it comes to the DIY aesthetic, right?
Mhm.
Because I mentioned this before we got started, but like if you looked at what the process of was, setting up a WordPress blog 20 years ago, it was a lot easier than frankly it is even to set up WordPress today, right? Like they still have their famous 5-minute install. And yes, you can find WordPress hosting in a million places, but WordPress itself is a much more complex application and does a lot more complex things. And people will, try to sell you more expensive things, even if all you want is a blog. And yes, I know WordPress.com exists. And then, you have services like micro.blog, which are great. Which can kind of give you kind of like the, kind of in between thing. But I feel like, if you want to start a newsletter and you don't want to use Substack, and you don't want to use like a hosted thing like Ghost, like it's actually a remarkably difficult thing to do. Like you have to do a lot of domain name verification stuff for your email. You have to figure out like who your email send host is going to be. Assuming you're not paying someone like Mailchimp, exorbitant amounts of money for emails, and there's a lot of things involved in that make it difficult for people to kind of have that indie aesthetic. Whereas, 2 decades ago, it was easy for people to kind of create a web forum or to create a blog, create, podcasts, right? And now I almost feel like, with very few exceptions, I think microblog is one of them. Um, they're like the barrier to entry, if you don't want to use some of these hosted services, is much higher than it was in the past. And that's interesting to me because in almost every other aspect of technology that we've seen, things get easier over time. But like the main concept of like creating a website is harder objectively today than it was when I was doing it when I was 12, right? I could go to GeoCities and I could write an HTML file and I could upload that file and I could see what I'm doing. Now I need to learn a JavaScript framework and I need to learn a bunch of other things. And I need to find out like, okay, what kind of, well, even if I'm doing static, hosting through someone like Vercel or Netlify, like that has a level of thing there too. Like now I need to learn, version control and Git, and I need to do a lot of other things. And so these things have become more complex if you're not using these hosted services. And I think sometimes that works to the detriment of the movement to try to decentralize things and have people do more of these DIY aesthetics. Because yes, a lot of us really like to have the nerdy APIs and the ability to pull things in ourselves and really customize things. And that's fantastic. But how do you bring people into that world? Because if your answer is like Mastodon is a perfect example, and I know they've made things easier in their apps and like what instances you do, but for the first few months that people were getting started trying to join Mastodon, um, people were always like, well, what instance do I join? Right. And so you choose an instance, and then maybe that instance goes under, or maybe it doesn't have the strongest backend, or maybe they have some policies that you don't like. Well, the Fediverse is very happy to say, oh, well, you can move anywhere you want. Well, you can, but you can't take your posts with you.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And there are other kind of limitations too. And then it's kind of forwarding things. And so there are these levels of complexity because of how these systems are designed that make even the very basic aspect of like, where do I sign up for an account, a difficult thing to figure out. And what are the rules here? And oh, well, some accounts have longer character limits than others, and some have certain things, certain provisions than others. And this is all going to be up to the administrator. That's one of the things I thought the Blue Sky did really well last year, was that and I know they're now kind of, like they're going into federation where people can host their own instances, but I thought it was very good to have kind of one default place and then say we will allow this API to be more open. And frankly, I think that's one of the reasons, other than just the massive network effect, of why something like Threads has so many more users than something like Mastodon. And it has to do with, I don't even think so much like being like centralized versus not, but just like eliminating some of those questions for people to get started. When, options can be a real challenge. But beyond that, I think we've also sometimes, some people who are behind some of these systems get really excited about all the cool things they're doing, but really don't think about, okay, but how can a normal person who doesn't have hours to invest in doing this get into it, right? Because when we're all kids, like, and we have time, it's great and you can dive into it. But when you're not, um, what are you going to do? You're going to say, oh, I'm gonna read about every aspect about how all this works and host my own newsletter. No, like that's why we wind up getting centralized and closed networks. Isn't some I think that people are ideologically opposed, but because the process of self-hosting has become much more complex than it was 2 decades ago. 2 decades ago, I had my own blog, on WordPress, and was able to find other people and get web mentions and ping backs when people would link to me or I would link to them, and that was kind of a conversation thing. And now the process of setting up a site, if you're not wanting to pay a lot of money a month, and if you don't know, like, well, what plugins do I need to use, what themes do I need to use, how do I need to configure this, like all these questions that you get started, you're just like, well, now I don't even want to do it anymore.
Mm. Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, it is interesting, like how every, like some things are easier and some things are just way more complicated. And like your example of like, it's almost impossible just to like make a simple HTML page with 2 tags and just run with it now, because it just feels like, well, here's the 3 frameworks you have to use and here's where you host it. And yeah, it feels, and like we're always fighting that of like, there's so much power like building something for the web, like there's so much flexibility we can give users, but like I feel like we're always fighting the tendency to add 50 checkboxes and like all this weird configuration that's possible, because like, yeah, like you said, it make it may it makes it harder to like feel like you understand the software and you can like kind of get into it. Yeah. Gene, do you have any where you want to go with that? I don't want to
I was
talk
just
too much.
thinking about when I used to be a web design teacher, which is pretty hysterical now to anybody who knows my, like, don't tell me about those APIs, don't tell me about whatever. And I remember actually when I mean, not just a teacher, but that was my career in the late 90s and early 2000s. And one of the things that turned me off of it was e-commerce, which sounds so funny because of course e-commerce is the lifeblood of the web, but
Mm-hmm.
it just became it, I went from I could design something totally myself from start to finish to having to work with people who also didn't really understand e-commerce, and trying to make it all work together. And it just so happened around in that time is when one of my clients, which was the time was Smile Software, said, we wouldn't mind it if you worked for us full time. And I was like, yeah, and then I can hire somebody to do this, which was like weird because I'm like, I can't believe I'm hiring a web designer, but I really don't want to do it anymore. I don't know. And so we did have fun back then. I don't know. I guess we're like the equivalent of like, the old time, you know, kids playing in the neighborhood, didn't have TVs and whatever. They just did they had fun. They went to the corner store. They got their penny candy. That was the web as far as I was concerned in the 90s. We had fun. Everybody could do it if they wanted to. That was, like it wasn't hard to teach it because in fact, that was one of the things that was exciting because people assumed it was hard. And
Right.
when I would show them and they would do it, like that, I've seen it so many times, the excitement of putting your first web page, like launching it in a browser, your HTML basic web page, nothing fancy. People love that, And so there's nothing like that anymore. I'm going to say there's nothing like that.
Mm.
Get off my lawn. This has been the get off my lawn portion
No,
of the
exactly, exactly.
conversation.
I was like, yeah, I don't want this to be like a negative thing or whatever, but yeah, there are things that like we've, but that we did have, and a lot of that complexity is great, and you do still see those communities. I know where people are pushing people to do those things and experiment, and I love that. But it just seems like it's harder maybe to surface them Like
Yeah.
maybe that's what it is, or maybe we just don't, maybe I just don't know the right places to go. But yeah, that was the beauty of the web at the beginning, was that you thought it was hard, but it wasn't. Anybody could kind of participate. And um that to me still is the magic of the web
Yeah.
ultimately,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
And it's there's also little things that we don't really think about. Anytime there's a some kind of abstraction or complexity, things get harder to get started. And actually CSS, you wouldn't think it would be like a major roadblock maybe, but just the idea of having a separate file now that we have to style things with instead of just like this is bold. I actually think that disconnect um, kind of hurts getting started because no, there's not just an HTML file. There's at least two files.
Right.
Probably some
yeah.
more than that, but
Right. But even then, it's like it's not just an HTML file and a CSS file. It's also like a JavaScript framework
yeah,
that's wrapping all this together. That's ultimately going to create those files, right? Like now I need to know all these React components, right?
yeah.
So doing that simple, like getting that simple page up, I actually need to know a whole bunch more. And I think that can be intimidating for some people. I think it's really exciting, and like
Mhm.
you get it and you just jump into it. I think for other people it can be just okay, you know what? I'm just going to go to Squarespace or whoever
Yeah.
and do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the members of our community, Pratik, had mentioned when I asked for questions, he said, like, is the Fediverse is kind of a cool idea, but it requires can normal people really get on it? And I mean, normal, obviously, for your definition of normal, but I was thinking about Christina, if you were like the wizard of the internet and you could just wave your magic wand, what's something you would make better? You don't have to program it. You just have to say it is now thus. Uh, so don't worry about the necessarily practicality, but just I'd be curious what would help people, our friends that are not in the business, for example.
I mean, I do think that a big thing that would help, like, with the Fediverse in general, would just be um genuinely kind of like um account portability and interoperability, right? Like I think that the idea would be like I can sign up for something and one place and I can take all of it with me to another if that's what happens, right? I think that the Fediverse is difficult for some people to get into because of that initial choice you have to make. And it is a choice because it's a false promise. And I've complained about this at length and the point that, like, people who are actively involved with Mastodon have agreed with me, and many people have disagreed with me and want to tell me I'm holding it wrong, and that's fine. You can have that opinion. That's completely okay. But I do feel like just reducing that sort of friction, even just to something as simple as like, where do I sign up? And if I make a mistake, or where I sign up, I don't lose everything that I've created, would go a long way for folks. Like that's one of the first things that I would do. And I think just like if I could create anything in the world, it probably would be Matt Mullen, like, probably would be the person who would create this. It probably would be an automatic thing at the end of the day. But it would be so cool if everybody had like their own and microblog is doing this to a certain extent. And maybe honestly, this is the real answer. Everybody should just get a microblog. But like if everybody just had like their own place where, make it very easy, where like this is where all my stuff is, but there was also a way to help link it to others. Like that's pie in the sky, but that would be like kind of my dream.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean that is, and when we talk about like the technical hurdles of the indie web, really at the core, the indie web is really just you need your own place. Like
Yeah.
forget about all the complexity, like just have your own place that links to other places. And if we could make that easier, so that's the default, um, and I mean, I guess, we for a while we had the rise of like Linktree and those type of things where it's like just a single page. And I guess those are still popular, but if we could help people just have that space, their own domain, and then from there it branches off so that people don't feel trapped. And even like what you were talking about with Twitter earlier, when you like accidentally got locked out of your account, like those kind of lessons of centralization where it's like you have no control all of a sudden.
Right.
But if people have that space where they have control, a lot of things become a lot easier.
100%. Yeah. To me, a lot of people, they were like, well, why don't you just leave Twitter? Who cares? Get off that site anyway. And I was like, well, first of all, A, it's not that easy for, some, work reasons. But B, this was the secondary thing. It's like, if I leave, I want to leave on my own terms.
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
that is like the real genuine danger of these centralized systems that are controlled by other things. Like my friend MG Siegler, he was banned from Threads for completely, like there was an error is what happened.
Hmm.
And he wound up losing access to his Instagram account, his Facebook accounts, his other accounts that were connected to it, because they were accusing him of doing something that he didn't do. And if he were not, a VC at Google Ventures, and didn't know everyone, how is a normal person supposed to reach a customer support person or try to get someone back, right? When you have hundreds of millions of users, and in Facebook's case, billions of users,
Yeah.
that's almost impossible, right? And like, I'm fortunate that my job at GitHub, we have a 100 million users, but there are enough of us that, like, we have humans that if somebody got locked out of their account for, an invalid reason, there is a human that someone that can look into that, right? Like I have the ability personally, if it came down to that, where I could investigate that. And we're small enough that we can, in terms of, how many people would have those requests in a day, that we could deal with that if we needed to. But if you don't have that sort of capability, and there's big networks and all the support stuff is automated, like, it can be really scary. And I think that, which is one of the benefits of the indie web. But, to the point we're making, that the problem with that is that getting started with the indie web is, I think, a little bit too difficult, for, I'm not going to say like normal people, but I think just for people who don't have the time to invest in figuring everything else out, and who maybe don't have like the, inclination to want to self-host everything. So yeah, I'm with you. It'd be great if we
Hmm.
all just had kind of our own, space,
Yeah.
my space, right?
There you go.
I'm
That is
joking.
a name. That's a great
Is
name.
that domain available? Gene, do we have any I haven't been paying attention. Do we have any
I
questions in
think
the
I've got I think I've been following the questions, and I think basically we were talking about um, this question of what makes it usable. I think that's where we all are getting stuck, is that, like, we create a whole community of new friends who are social media and blogging savvy, because they're there, and that's great. I love making new friends, but all my old friends, my friends that are still my friends in many other ways, except Facebook was like a place where people like that would be. And
Yeah.
I quit Facebook, like, many years ago, and it was hard because I knew I was going to lose a lot of that, like, source of updates from people, but I just didn't want to do it anymore. But I think, yeah, somebody's asked, I think this was also Pratik, is there a Dunbar number for newsletters? Like, that's
Yeah.
that,
That's a great question.
what's the most, what's the most, and there is one, I don't know what it is, but we're human beings. We can only take in so much. And we've really, like, the internet and computers have allowed us to to manage more information, but ultimately we're still, just evolutionarily speaking, we're not going to become computers and be able to have everything at our fingertips. I don't care how good your to-do list or your personal knowledge information management system is. You can only know so much. I don't know. Anyway, I'm ranting again. What is this?
No, you're right
What's
though. I
the
mean, and
question?
no, but that's but I think there is a Dunbar number. I don't know what it is, but there definitely is one, and I probably hit it. I have to go through every year and like audit like my Substack subscriptions and the subscriptions that I pay through other ways, and it's not even a monetary thing. It's honestly like an attention thing, right? And because it's like,
Right.
I only have so much time, and the more things you have going on, like, my own life, I can no longer be as plugged into as many things as I used to be plugged into, which pains me personally as someone who wants to overcome the very real barrier and wants to know everything about everything. And I know that's impossible, but like, I aspire to that. But like, there's only so many hours in the day, we can only keep track of so many
Yeah.
things. And I think that is the one kind of, for me, kind of the double-edged sword of the indie web and these sorts of federated systems, is that as much as I love the aesthetic and I love encouraging people to have their own communities and do their own things, the very nature of that does mean that it's similar to with anything else, like with culture and music, right? Like there have been a lot of discussions where the biggest artists in the world right now are smaller, relatively speaking, than the biggest artists in the world were 50 years ago. And that's because we don't live in a monoculture. And that's a very good thing. That's a very good thing. But the downside of that is that we, of not being in a monoculture, not having a certain number of broadcast networks, not only having, having more choices, is that, it can be harder to have, I guess, like a one conversation. And instead we have to become more I guess considerate about what we choose to invest our time in. And that can be, at least for me, just speaking for myself, that can be a challenge. I liked it when it was just kind of like given to me, right? Like this is what the topic is now, right? These are the big things that are going on, instead of, oh, there's 10,000 things that you can focus on. um Sometimes having the option can be more difficult. And
Yeah.
even though it can also be at the same time, paradoxically, uh, very freeing and allowing for so many different things.
It's true. And I think that we're lucky that we get to see these things happen, and we have more, maybe a little more ability to make choices for what we want to happen. But um, it actually makes me think of what I did want to bring up, podcasting, because that's like a
Yeah.
very clear adjacent. If you have a few more minutes, I don't want to.
Oh, of course. Of course.
We it's been a similar thing, I feel like, except except the podcasting really takes attention. So, but that's what makes it more valuable as a podcaster. If people are willing to listen to your podcast, is
Yeah.
much different game than when they subscribe to your newsletter. And I wonder, do you have? Well, you still have a podcast, right? With
With
Brett
Brett
Terpstra.
Terpstra, yeah, and Jeff Gunsel overtired, yeah. But no, I mean, I did a
Yeah.
podcast for 9 years, Rocket, which was a great run. And I think what we did notice, like I think some podcasts, you notice the same thing kind of with newsletters, like you can get overload, right? Like how many podcasts do you regularly listen to? And I meet people, all the time, who would say to me, and I want to be very honest, never offended, be like, oh, I used to listen to your podcast, and I get it, right? Because I understand there are things I used to listen to as well, but it's one of those things. It's kind of like blogging or anything else. Like if you to do it and to maintain it, like you have to care. And with the podcast, I think even it's takes much more. Uh, at least I think if you want to do it well, of staying interested and staying, uh, you know, um, focused on it versus, okay, my blog that I post to, once a year or once a month or once a day, right? Like, because to your point, that there is a much higher level of commitment involved. Like if I'm listening to this podcast, like shows that I listen to, religiously, like week after week after week, it's like, okay, this is my appointment time for this. I'm giving up something else potentially to do this. And so part of the implicit contract with that is, as a podcaster, you have to know somebody else is giving up their time to listen to this. So I need to be willing to give up, my time and my focus to put something good into it, which is interesting. I don't feel like we have that same feeling with the written word that you have. And frankly, even with video to a certain extent, I feel like audio is almost unique in that regard, and that like you are very much taking someone's attention. And I think, at least as a creator, like you're aware of that. And so you have to put in the work to hopefully make it worth it for them. Because if it's not, people will stop listening.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think it's one of those things that it looks harder than it is. I mean, quality wise, it depends, there's a range, but We've had a lot of folks on Micro.blog start podcasts who had not done them before because
Oh
we've
yeah,
made podcasting part of the platform. And when you
I love that.
realize it's a file that gets uploaded to the internet and goes into an RSS feed. Like, of course, there's still the question, which I haven't been able to get people to understand what is RSS. That is, for that as it is, it is the basis of everything we're talking about. But I think the average person still isn't quite
They don't quite
um,
get it. No,
get
but you're
it.
right though. The barrier to entry, interestingly, with podcasting, I think is the one area where it's actually lower than where we were, 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Like it's much easier to start a podcast now with lots of different services. I think the harder thing with the podcast, and this is, and to me, this is a completely fair trade-off, is just like maintaining it, right? Like keeping up the commitment, keeping up whatnot. It's easier than ever to get a good sounding microphone and to put in the work and to be able to upload it to, Spotify or Apple or whatever and have it live there. And it can be technologies have, companies have made that a very simple process. So which I love because people can start them up and you can have really great conversations and hear things. Um, in some ways, podcasts kind of are probably to me maybe the most reminiscent, even more than newsletters, of the old school blogging thing because you really can see a lot of different voices appear, and then people decide, am I going to do this? Or is this just something that I want to, dip in and dip out of, which is okay, right?
Mhm.
Not everybody has to do everything forever, but I feel like, yeah, that's a great point. I actually, yeah, I think that the podcasting goes against my other point about how much more complex things are. Podcasting is an area where it's actually significantly easier than it was 2 decades ago. And that's honestly probably one of the reasons why, I mean, some of the current ad momentum stuff notwithstanding, why we've had such a boom in podcasting over the last decade.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Whereas we haven't had a blogging boom, we haven't had, some of these other things haven't taken off, but podcasting, which is like kind of in people's own voices and own spaces, has taken off in ways
yeah,
that's separate from, you know, um, like commercial entity run. Like obviously you still have those sorts of networks and whatnot, but like that hasn't stopped the number of individuals
Yeah.
who still create podcasts.
Yeah. The tools are just
right.
way better than when you had to like hand roll your RSS feed and figure out your audio formats and all that sort of thing. The tools are way better. And I think the tools, you don't really call them tools, but like social media posting, the user experience is also better. But that hasn't gotten to blogging, like old school blogging. Like
Right.
those usability improvements haven't quite, you know, trickled down to everyone.
You
Um,
know what I think it is?
mhm.
I think that it's podcasting. You have a centralized directory. You have a way to search
Yeah. Yeah.
and we never really
That
had that
makes
for
sense.
blogging,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the whole thing too. Just like Apple's, the way they've sort of just nicely curated directory for everyone without really having it part of their business at all. Um, it feels a little fragile,
Yeah.
but yeah, so far so good. Wherever you find your podcasts, search and
I'm heavily knocking on wood right now.
yeah. No, you're right though. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It's easy. It's easier to find. You hear about something, you search, you find it, you click subscribe, you hit follow. Yeah, you're good.
no,
Um, the discovery, even though it's a little bit even more disconnected than it feels like it. Yeah, it works. It works.
Yeah.
Um, you're talking about the. I think we'll wrap up here like in a few minutes. I think. But to kind of close out, I was thinking when you're talking about like the time to create a podcast and like respecting your audience, like taking the time to do it right. And it reminded me of something I wanted to ask about, and this might be more of a comment than a question, but like we are in the midst of a major upheaval with AI and a lot of things generated not by humans, not with care and
Yes.
attention, just like spewing out in the internet, everything.
Yep.
And like I think we're all gonna have to wrestle with like what does that mean, and like this is super useful. So like what kind of tools can we build? But also we like human created art
Hmm.
and things. And it reminded me, so I think it was Ben Thompson recently was talking about like how do you compete with like infinite, AI generated content. And like, one way is you have your brand, you have your own personal, like people respect, and they
Yep.
whether you're New York Times or you're just some blog that people love, they know you're human. And it reminded me of a talk you gave at Singleton like 10 years ago
Oh, right.
about, I don't know if you remember this, but it left a really big impact on me actually, of like the idea that like you can't, to frame it, your basic premise in this one little part of the talk was, um, like I can't just take any work that people, I can't write about like anything people want if they're going to pay me. I need, like it's my name out there. Like I
Yes.
have to, all I
All I
have
have
is
is
my
my name.
name. Yeah, exactly. All I have
Yeah.
is my name. And I remember blogging about it because I was like, that's it, right? It's like you can't compromise on who you are and like what you're putting out there because
Hmm.
you're attached to it.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's so, and yeah, and so it just makes me think of with AI too. It's like if people feel overwhelmed with like, there's going to be all this content, there's going to be all these fake videos. Well, the way to combat that maybe is like, leaning into the personal voice and, this is my blog, this is my name, this is the thing, this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I think there are going to be very real technical problems that I think will more than likely be ironically probably solved in some ways by AI and by technology. Like I think almost like the AI overrun of content will be solved in some ways by AI and other things because they'll be able to recognize those tools and they will rank them as lower quality as
Right.
others will. And I think
Hmm.
there's also a big difference. And you made this clear, but I'll just say it anyway. I think like being like using AI to assist in doing something versus just having it generated itself, right? Like I think that
Right.
there's like a different quality difference.
Totally.
But yeah, no, you're right. And thank you for bringing that talk up. That was one of my favorite talks I've ever given. And yeah, I think about that a lot. Like all I have is my name. And I think you're right. I think for all of us, for what we put out there, like that's what we kind of have to lean into. Like this is who I am and this is what I've done. And it's as much fun as it is and as great as it is to automate all the things. Again, going back to like why I still don't have a newsletter. I know I could automate some scripts together and be like, oh, put together all the things that I've done and put it in one digest. And that's fine. Um, but for me, I don't know if that would be an experience that I would want to like put my name on,
Mm.
right? Like if I'm going to create something that I want it to actually be,
Yeah.
something that I feel good with my name on, and that's going to be different for each person. And I don't want to like impugn anybody who has other types of setups and who likes those sorts of things at all. But just I think you're right. I think that's how we have to kind of lean in. That's how we get past all the other things that are out there is just knowing, okay, this is a real person, this is a real thing, and choosing to give our attention to the people who are willing to, you know, put their name on it or
Hmm.
their pseudonym or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And it doesn't, like you said, it's different for everyone. And also that doesn't mean we have to be like super proud of everything we create.
No, absolutely
But
not.
yeah,
Yeah.
like a lot, we all put stuff out on the internet that's not the best thing.
So
But
many bad blogs for me, speaking for myself, so many bad
yeah,
tweets, so many bad posts. Absolutely. Yeah.
right. But it's authentic probably, right? It's
Yes.
still it's
I
still
hope so.
us. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed talking to
Thank you.
you and catching up, and
Yeah.
best of luck with everything. Yeah.
Likewise. And thanks to you. And thanks for creating microblog. And again, like being like at the forefront of this and seeing this before anybody else did and creating such a great community and keeping that going. Cause I know that that's a lot of work and I know that it's hard with all these things that are happening. And I really appreciate what both of you do and will continue to do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll see you around on the internet,
See
Christina,
you,
as
see you on the
usual.
internet.
Okay, take care.
Thanks.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.